From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump kicks off his bid to settle the war in Ukraine, and his defense secretary offers early concessions to Vladimir Putin without Ukraine at the table. What does this tell us about what Trump wants and how he'll proceed to settle the war? Plus, Trump is on the path to get all of his cabinet nominees confirmed by the U.S. Senate, even those who have views that are profoundly different than those of most Republican senators. How did the president pull this off? Those are our subjects for today in Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot, the editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues Kyle Peterson and Bill McGurn. Welcome, gentlemen. The big week for Ukraine policy ahead. The annual U.S. Security Conference in Munich, Germany. Trump announced that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio will begin negotiations right away over the Ukraine war. Let's listen to Trump talk about his motivations.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace. I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
Well, Bill, Donald Trump ducked the question of whether Ukraine would be a participant, and he issued his statement yesterday talking about his negotiations after a call with Vladimir Putin. In that statement, he said, well, I'm going to call Zelensky and tell him what we just decided. Afterwards, he did talk to Zelensky, issued another statement on Truth Social, his social media site, saying he had a great conversation with Zelensky. But today, Zelensky said he will not abide by an agreement that Putin and Trump might settle on unless he's at the table. So how do you read this early maneuvering?
Well, I think Zelensky is perfectly right to say you're determining the future of my country, my borders, whether foreign troops are going to be allowed on them, and you're not going to have us at the table. Look, I think there's no persuading Donald Trump on doing a deal with Russia. He's campaigned for that for so long. The substantive difference is that, for example, I think you share with me that I have with the Trump administration on Ukraine policy, they're not going to make a dent on them. I would say that what should make a dent on him is that I think Ukraine is going to be his legacy, however it goes. If it goes well, Ukraine is independent, preserves and thrives and stuff. Okay, you get credit. I don't think that's the likeliest outcome. If it goes down, it's going to be a mark against him, just the way that it was a mark against Biden to come into office and have that humiliation in Afghanistan. So I do worry when I hear Zelensky might not be at the table. That really worries me. And I think it's actually the eerie parallels to Saigon in 1975, the Paris Peace Accords done without President to South Vietnam. And look what happened. You know, shortly after they made a deal, a year or so, it was in communist hands.
All right, let's talk a little more detail, break some of this down, because while Trump's statement was general, Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, was in Europe on Wednesday, meeting with the Ukraine Contact Group, the coalition of nations that have been helping Ukraine defend itself. And he put a little more meat on the bones of what the contours of a deal might be like. Let's listen.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
Article 5 being the provision of the North Atlantic Treaty that calls for the defense of one member of the organization by all members of the organization if that nation is attacked. Now, a day later, after Hegseth made these comments, he walked back in a tweet the NATO point, saying that he didn't speak for Donald Trump and that the President of the United States is a chief negotiator here and he will make a decision on NATO membership with Ukraine, not Pete Hegseth. Kyle, clearly there was some blowback for what Hegseth said. Maybe he was out in front of his skis in the administration, or maybe the White House and other people heard back from the Europeans and Zelensky that said, hey, why are you making what amounts to a premature concession to Putin before you even start negotiations? You mean you're not going to be able to join NATO? You mean we have to abide by the current borders? But 20% of Ukraine's occupied by Russia. I think everybody assumes there'll be a negotiated settlement here, and has for a long time, and I think Biden would have said so too. But the idea that you're making concessions after a phone call with Vladimir Putin does not bode well.
It does strike me as a strange approach for the U.S. Defense Secretary to take, and not exactly the art of the deal, not the way that President Trump approaches many other controversies that he's been in. His general MO is to go out in public and demand everything, 1,000%, including the shirt off your back. We're going to take the Panama Canal back. We're going to take Greenland. We're going to take over Gaza. And what you hear coming out of people who are defending that approach is that this is escalate to de-escalate. So he's going to ask for everything, and then we're going to get around the negotiating table, and that's the starting point for the negotiation. And so I find it strange that this is the exception where the defense secretary is out doing the opposite and making concessions, even if they are based on some fundamental realities, even if people who are on Ukraine's side think it is probably unrealistic to expect the borders to go way back to where they were in 2014. Why say that in public? Why not hold that in reserve to make the concession when you're actually around the negotiating table, probably with Zelensky at your side?
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about just who would be these peacekeepers in Ukraine if the United States isn't part of the operation when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot on Potomac Watch, the daily podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion page. And I'm here with Bill McGurn and Kyle Peterson. I want to stipulate a couple of things here, Bill and Kyle. One is that Trump, I think, is inheriting a bad situation. He's probably right that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he had won a second term. And Biden's half-hearted support for Ukraine, a lot of chest beating about how virtuous he was and helping the allies, and we were doing this for Ukraine. But half-hearted support in the sense that he was always late with weapons and always reluctant to provide the highest class weapons that might have allowed Ukraine to take back some of its territory. Biden feared escalation himself with Russia, so he leaves Trump with a war that is essentially a stalemate and a bloody one, and one in which Putin's troops are making incremental progress at great human cost in the east of Ukraine. So it's a bad situation that Trump is inheriting. But, Bill, presidents don't get to choose the situations that they inherit, and they have to deal with them as they are.
Yeah, not only that, Paul. Look, Joe Biden poisoned the political atmosphere for aid to Ukraine because people saw billions going and no real progress. As you point out, it's because he held back all the time over significant weapons that might change the course of the war. But as you say, presidents, before they get in office, they don't complain, oh, it's a really lousy situation. They say, I'm the one to fix it. Vote me. I think President Trump campaigned on solving this in 24 hours. Now,
not 48, Bill, not 72. 24.
Yeah. So, all right, I don't take them literally, and I wouldn't rule out negotiations altogether. But Pete Hegseth's comments, I just don't believe they're totally off the top of his head. I have to believe they have the support of the president. They fit in with what he wants. He sees it as a giant sinkhole and not our fight. And so to give away, in principle, the two things that the Ukrainians would care about, the territory that has been conquered and also NATO membership, I don't know what they're going for. And it strikes me that a big part of the deal would have to be to include the Ukrainians. I mean, why negotiate with just the aggressors?
Yeah.
It's beyond me. I fear what's going to happen to the Ukrainians is what happened to South Vietnam in 1972.
Well, Pete Hegseth did say, we want a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. And he said that durable peace must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. But it won't be as part of NATO, and it won't involve any U.S. troops. So he talks about the peacekeeping forces who could enforce a security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. So European troops, you can imagine, would be Polish and maybe Baltic states, maybe German and French. I just throw that out there as possibilities. But who are these non-European troops if the United States isn't going to do it? I mean, you're talking about Canada with its vast military arsenal. You're talking about Australia. They're brave, terrific, but it's not going to be anywhere near the U.S. in power. And if the U.S. isn't willing to back Ukraine, one other point, if we do have this European force, and somehow Putin goes into Ukraine again, are we going to stand back and say, sorry, we're not going to support you? That's your problem, Europe? So there's a real disconnect here between making these security guarantees credible and the degree of American involvement.
Right. The devil is in the details here. And one big question is also whether these countries have the capacity, the military capacity, the hardware, the troops to do that kind of security guarantee in the first place, to say nothing of whether they are really willing to do that in Poland and France and Germany. But it does raise the question of whether this is a diplomatic cover to some extent. I mean, if you have a non-NATO security guarantee backed up by German and French forces, let's say, and as you say, Putin goes into Ukraine again, is the U.S. really going to stand by and let those NATO allies in this non-NATO theater get rolled over by Russians? Or is the answer to that somewhere underneath this is still going to be some kind of U.S. security guarantee? And so, Putin could come out of this negotiation and say, well, Ukraine is not really in NATO. It starts to look like double secret NATO membership if the U.S. is underlying it the whole time.
Well, that could make some sense. The other point I want to stipulate is that I'm certainly not opposing a negotiated settlement. And I'm not saying that Ukraine has to get every acre of its territory back to get a negotiated settlement. That is, in fact, unrealistic at this stage. But if you want a deal that has Ukraine sovereign and prosperous and linked, as I hope it would be, through the European Union to the West, Bill, on economic matters, it's going to have some kind of guarantees, and I think its public will insist on it, that don't set up Putin in a year or 2 or 3 or 5 to reinvade the country after he has rearmed and gotten all of his frozen assets back. And meanwhile, Ukraine hasn't been able, because it hasn't had the support from the West, to be able to deter Russia adequately.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The whole credibility of a deal will be on whether it has a deterrent for Putin to go back in. Again, not to harp on Vietnam, but there's a famous meeting with Kissinger in the Oval Office in August 1972. And Kissinger said the chances of the deal with North Vietnam, the aggressor, were about 50-50. And he said that it would give Nixon a decent interview. He said, quote, "We've got to find some formula that holds the thing together for a year or two. After a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle it, say, this October, by January 1974, no one will give a damn." That's my fear for Ukraine, that in 2 years, people will be less enthusiastic about making good on any security guarantee. Look, I agree with Trump that Europe is not pulling its weight and stuff, but NATO, any of these institutions, we should have learned by now, depends on U.S. leadership. That would be the thing to marshal. I would say also, finally, for domestic political reasons, you look around the world at Iran, North Korea, China, Taiwan, and you think, if Putin gets away with his aggression in Ukraine, what is going to stop these other guys from their actions? I think it could be very hard for Donald Trump. He usually understands incentives, and he's going to be making it very hard for himself.
Well, and on that point about overseas implications, I mean, Hegseth said in his remarks to the contact group, he said, look, Europe, you have to essentially take care of Europe, and we will pivot to taking over security in Asia and our own borders here at home. You can't disagree with that in theory, but there was an implication from what he said was that together we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific respectively. Now, again, the devil is in the details, Kyle, but that suggests to me that the Trump administration would very much like to be able to wash its hands of Europe, even if it doesn't formally leave NATO, but say, this is your problem, guys, and we're going to focus nearly all of our attention on our military assets on deterring China. Well, as Bill suggests, if Ukraine is essentially forgotten and doesn't stay sovereign, independent, and prosperous, China's going to say, I get it. Are you really going to defend Taiwan, Mr. President? Are you really going to put your aircraft carriers at risk if we decide we really need to take Taiwan? I think Xi Jinping's thinking. Trump doesn't do that.
Sure. It's a real problem of credible deterrence. And it's hard to imagine a situation other than total and complete victory that Putin almost had in the early days of this invasion when he was very close to capturing Kyiv. It's hard to imagine an outcome that he would like better than the U.S. skedaddling out of Europe as a result of some kind of negotiation and a weakening of that NATO deterrence. And one other final thought I would throw out here is having Zelensky at the table. Part of the reason that it's so important is that it's Ukraine and Ukraine's people who have taken up this defense. That's why the Vietnam parallel only goes so far. I mean, if you look at, there's different numbers, but this is ukraineoversight.gov, the amount of money that the United States has sent to Ukraine over 3 fiscal years, according to this site, is Congress appropriated $174 billion. So something like $60 billion a year over 3 years. And I'm not saying that that's not real money, because it is real money, but it is not the kind of sacrifice that the people of Ukraine, the people who are out there on the front lines, have undergone.